Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the United Kingdom. They're in full campaign mode there with a month till the general election, and the economy is front and centre. Stay the course or try a different approach? We look at the paths the UK might end up taking. Also this week, a big look at human trafficking. It's a $150 billion a year problem. But more importantly, millions of people around the world are trapped in desperate situations, exploited for illicit financial gains. And having taken the medicine, Greece now coughs up a $500 million payment to the IMF. It means more time, but what else is round the corner for Europe's most indebted nation? We often look at the effect elections will have on economies. After all, they are pivotal moments. They can produce an entire sea change sometimes. And in around a month, the United Kingdom has its chance to either stay the course, as the sitting government would have it, or move towards a more socialist economy. May 7th is the date. Britons will elect 650 members of Parliament, the bulk of them in England, but more than 100 are in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well. And the predictions are this election will be close, very close. So close, there is a likelihood of a hung parliament whereby no single party would have a majority of the seats. That would take the UK once again into coalition territory. Now, this time around, the Conservative Party is trumpeting falling unemployment, higher wages and strong overall economic growth as a result of its 5 years in the coalition government, while the opposition Labour Party says living standards are still being squeezed by the slowest recovery in 100 years. So when faced with such political crossfire, we need clarity. And there's no clarity like official statistics to figure out what the real story is. Now, the Office of National Statistics in the UK says this. The British economy grew 2.8% last year, its fastest growth in 9 years and some of the best in the developed world. That has put the UK back to pre-financial crisis levels of growth. And at the same time, the British public's feeling more optimistic. Consumer confidence is at its highest point for 12 years. And living standards are higher than they were at the last election as well. So you can see why the Conservatives want Britain to, and I keep saying this, but it's their line, stay the course, which they've taken. But some economists reckon the government's been part of the problem, not the solution. And it's in fact only since it started to relax the very harsh austerity measures it put in place that the economy actually began picking up speed. Not surprisingly, the opposition is using such claims to boost its campaign. Here's Ed Miliband, the Labour Party leader, on why more Conservative rule would apparently spell disaster.
It is a recipe for at least 2 years of uncertainty in which inward investment would drain away. 2 years of uncertainty in which businesses will not be able to plan for the future. And 2 years of wasted opportunities for progress, for profit and for prosperity. It is a clear and present danger to British jobs, British business, British families and British prosperity.
Now, the 2 years he's referring to there is the Conservatives' promise to hold by 2017 a referendum on Britain's EU membership. We'll talk about that and a whole lot more now with Ferdinando Giuliano. He is an economics correspondent at the Financial Times newspaper in London. Ferdinando, it seems to me that we're just in this classic election phase. Official statistics come out and the Conservatives say, hey, look, this proves our point. And then Labour comes along and says, no, look, it proves our point. They are always going to interpret things differently. I'm just wondering how you've interpreted it and where you think the UK economy is.
Well, I think the UK economy is in pretty good shape compared to other G7 economies. Growth last year was the fastest in the G7 club, so that's pretty good. And at the same time, unemployment is coming down sharply. It's below 6% at the moment, which means and real wages are finally starting to rise, largely thanks to inflation, which has fallen to zero. Of course, that's the consequence of low oil prices. But there are some signs of weaknesses in the economy. Productivity in particular is really, really bad, meaning that the economy just can't produce enough goods and services given the amount of labor which is employed. That's been stagnant throughout the coalition record. And the external deficit is really in the red. It's around 6%, 5.5%, which is the highest since the post-war period.
The figures show, though, and this is what Labour picks up on, that Britain is going through its slowest recovery in 100 years. Do we do we take a long-term view like that? Is that actually relevant, or is it more about what this coalition has achieved or not achieved in the last 5 years?
Well, sure. I mean, I think Labour certainly has a point in pointing out the fact that this recovery has been very slow by historic standards. It's taken many years for the UK to go back just to the level it was before the crisis. But at the same time, I think it's important to look at what's happened around the world. Every major economy has really had difficulties during this recovery, and at the same time the UK was hit indirectly by the Eurozone crisis. So I think Labour is right in pointing out to the fact that the recovery has been very slow, but at the same time there are some external factors which we shouldn't really forget.
Well, that EU is such an important external factor, so why don't we just stay with that for a moment. You've got the Conservative Party talking about a referendum on EU membership. An in or out referendum if it is returned to power. At the very least, whether the UK stays in the EU or not, at the very least it means uncertainty, and that's not good for business, is it?
Indeed, I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses of the Conservative programme vis-à-vis business, is this referendum uncertainty, which may last for, as we know, for a couple of years, and it's not very clear. I mean, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, assuming he stays in power, is saying he wants a new, better deal from the EU. That means repatriating some powers and getting some assurances over not devolving more powers. And then he will decide where he stands. But then on the right-hand side of his party, he's got people who really just want to take the UK out. Right. The rest of the EU is by far the UK's single largest trading partner, and there are fears that many businesses could move away from London and relocate somewhere on the continent or perhaps in Ireland, where the UK to live.
Let's talk briefly about the two main parties and I guess their main economic planks that they have. The Conservative Party, their line, and I've said it before, it's stay the course. Don't deviate, we're recovering well, you should trust us to finish the job. On the face of it, that sounds like a good argument because the UK is moving forward, by the numbers at least. As you said, it's one of the strongest G7 nations out there. Is that the line the Conservative Party peddles? Is it as strong as they would like us to think it is? Put it that way.
I think it's a perfectly sensible message to try and pitch. I mean, things are not great, they could be better, but if you look around the world, the UK is doing pretty well and things are going back on the right track. The Conservatives are arguing they're getting the country back on the right track, fixing the public finances, getting going again, and unemployment is coming down. I think that's a perfectly sensible message for them to try to pitch. Now, of course, the opposition has a different message, and that says, look, growth may be good, but living standards have been pretty poor. They have stagnated for most of this government, and they're only very slowly recovering now. What the Labour Party, the left-wing Labour Party, is trying to advocate is that really this recovery has been for very few, for the rich, for the wealthy, for the friends of the Conservatives, the way they depict this. And they are making a case for somewhat a more interventionist approach by the government into the economy.
I guess the thing for the Labour Party is that they have this very populist message which will probably resonate with a lot of people who, as you say, have seen the living conditions and the work and the job all go down in the last 5 years. And they'll be saying, yeah, they'll agree, yes, tax the rich. In fact, what is it? It's raising income tax for those who earn over £150,000, tax on homes over £2 million. There's a risk there, though, isn't there, if you alienate business, perhaps?
Indeed, I think that's one of the key problems Labour faces. There was a letter in a British newspaper just a few days ago with 100 business leaders saying that the UK should not vote for Labour. But at the same time, I think they have a strong positive message to send to business over Europe. The Labour Party doesn't want to have a referendum over the EU at the moment. It thinks the situation between the UK and the EU is just too fluid because the Eurozone is integrating, and the Labour Party thinks it's better to see first where the Eurozone heads and then for the UK eventually to decide. So although I think there is a risk in this kind of interventionist rhetoric from Labour, and business is already pushing back and rallying behind the Conservative, I think when it comes to Europe, Labour has a stronger message it can send to business than the Tories.
Ferdinando Giuliano talking UK economics with us on Counting the Cost. Thank you.
Thank you.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, Greece buys itself some more time with a $500 million payment to the IMF. But no sooner is one deadline passed than another one looms. That story a little later on. We're going to turn our attention now, though, to a pretty grim topic, unfortunately, human trafficking, and some quite astounding numbers on just how bad the problem is. We're going to start with the situation as it was 10 years ago. Statistics from the International Labour Organization, which show that back in 2005 there were at least 2.4 million trafficked persons at any given time in the world. Look at it now, 21 million is the latest estimate. And the money being made is absolutely staggering. Again, you go back to 2005, we were talking about a $32 billion global industry annually, which was bad enough. These days, it's way up at $150 billion profit a year from other people's suffering. The problem's particularly bad in the Asia-Pacific, where there are around 3.5 million vulnerable refugees. 4 years ago, 32 countries in the region signed a framework agreement to try to curb the problem. But in southern Thailand, they're not waiting around for results. Some locals have taken matters into their own hands to stop human trafficking, arming themselves to stop their communities from descending into lawlessness. This report is from Margaret Ortigas.
Deep in the jungles of southern Thailand, these men patrol one of Asia's busiest smuggling routes. They're all volunteers who have answered their government's call for civilians to do what they can to stop human traffickers from using Thailand as a transit point. Thousands of refugees from Myanmar and Bangladesh come through here every year in search of better lives. And these men hope that taking matters into their own hands will prevent a rise in crime and lawlessness because of the presence of illegal migrants and the armed gangs that smuggle them through.
The government officials are involved with the human traffickers. This is our biggest challenge. Many of the local villagers are also involved, but I don't think they benefit as much as the officials.
Not far from the jungle, refugees rescued from armed smugglers try to enjoy a semblance of freedom. Fatima paid traffickers to help her and her daughters flee a minority camp for Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. They spent a month on a boat and then were to be smuggled through Thailand across to Malaysia. The volunteer militia rescued her as traffickers tried to lead her group through the dense jungle.
The guards were very violent. They were always beating the Rohingya. They even beat us with the guns they carried. Sometimes they used a rope too. 2 men were shot dead and one was beaten to death. When I saw it, I just wanted to die. The suffering was very bad.
To prevent further suffering, the volunteers set up checkpoints and pretty much act as the local police. They have the support of the community, who give them food, petrol, and money for their needs. But not everyone believes this is a good thing. The leaders of the minority Muslim groups here are concerned the presence of armed civilian rescuers is just going to complicate matters further.
If the Muslims are carrying weapons, the Rohingya still know that they will get treated fairly. But if the Buddhists have weapons, and I'm not saying all of them, but some will intimidate and treat Rohingya very harsh.
But that was not the case for Fatima and her daughters. They were brought to a shelter and say they are just glad to be alive. Fatima still aims to get to her husband in Malaysia. With no one stopping them, the men in the jungle say they'll continue their work, armed and determined to step in and fill the gaps their government has been unable to.
Well, we've got two guests this week to talk through the issue of human trafficking. We're going to start in Geneva with Beat Andries, who is the head of the International Labour Organization's Forced Labour Programme. And Beat, if you'd just given me those figures from 2005, I would have been fairly shocked. But the increase over these 10 years has been quite incredible, particularly the amount of money involved. I don't like saying this, but it's a whole industry based on suffering.
Indeed, according to our most recent count, there are at least 21 million men, women and children in forced labor, and they generate about 150 billion US dollars of illicit profits every year. Those numbers are indeed very shocking. Forced labor trafficking affects every country, every region of the world, and it's time to take action.
Sorry, $150 billion. I want to stay with that question just a moment longer because it's staggering. How do you even calculate that?
Well, first of all, we've looked at the sectors and industries where forced labor and slavery is most prevalent. It's the sex industry, it's agriculture, construction, different forms of manufacturing, domestic service, mining. all sectors where you have a lot of high labor turnover and often low-skilled work. And we have calculated the profits by using different methods, but essentially it's calculated on the basis of value added of those workers in those sectors, presuming that they don't receive a fair wage. Often they don't receive a wage at all.
Let me get a little bit more specific regionally, Beat, because I mentioned this before. About 4 years ago, there was this framework signed in the Asia Pacific by about 32 countries trying to deal with people smuggling and trafficking. 4 years, I mean, it sounds like a sort of good amount of time to maybe start making a difference. But as you and I have just discussed, this problem is so huge. I mean, have they been able to make any real inroads in that time?
Well, there has been tremendous progress in recent years, in particular with regards to legislation. In most countries, forced labor and trafficking is now clearly criminalized and punished. But of course, much more needs to be done to address the root causes, not just the symptoms. And this requires really a look at the socioeconomic root causes, in particular vulnerability of households to sudden income shocks, the way people are recruited across international borders, but also within their countries, the whole issue of education and literacy. Those are issues we've just started to tackle. And I think if we are more serious about preventive measures, not just prosecution, we will see more progress in the years to come.
But do you ever, in your job and with the people around you, do you ever just sit there and think this is just too big? You know, it's not the type of thing you want to give up on, obviously, but it must be very challenging for you and your team to look at this problem and, as you say, to deal with the root causes, not just the symptoms, in such a big problem.
Indeed, each case is one case too many. So we are also dealing with a problem that has been with humanity for centuries, and we are dealing with deeply entrenched practices of discrimination and social exclusion that you cannot solve within a day. However, the political commitment is there. The United Nations member states are clearly behind the goal of eradicating forced labor by 2025. We have seen increased commitment also at regional levels. So with the increased political commitment as well as a social movement of citizens, of people behind this, I think we can make a difference.
Beat Andries from the ILO in Geneva, we thank you very much for your time. And from Geneva, we move to London to speak to Nick Grono. He's with something called the Freedom Fund. This is a private donor fund looking for ways to combat slavery and trafficking. Nick, welcome. I just want some specifics, first of all, of what you do, because Beat told us about the scope of the issue and indeed, the actual issues at hand. But you're on the front line with all of this. What do you do to help people caught up in slavery and trafficking?
So if you look at somewhere like India, which is estimated to have perhaps half the world's people who are in slavery and forced labour and bondage, a typical situation might be where you find a whole community that is working on a brick kiln, and they're forced to work, men, women and children, and they work long hours and they're not free to leave because they have these illegal debts that they can't pay off. And the brick kiln owner might have hired thugs who will ensure that everyone continues to work. So they're working on a daily basis, excruciating hours. The kids aren't going to school to produce bricks. And so a way of combating that is to work with these communities, first to persuade them that they're entitled to be free, because often they've worked for decades in this situation and don't actually understand that they have a choice to walk away. So you work with these communities, persuade them that they're entitled to leave this situation of forced labour, and then work with the local authorities to get them out of there, to confront the brick kiln owner, and then to provide them with opportunities to do work that is free and fair. And it's a long, painstaking process, but a very rewarding one. In our work in northern India, just in our very first year last year, we helped bring 2,000 people out of a situation of forced labour and bondage, and helped bring several thousand children back into schooling, into the schooling system.
Hired thugs, Nick, you used that phrase and that really stuck in my head there, because that sounds quite frightening, to be honest. This is dangerous work, isn't it? And I suspect made more dangerous by the fact that it's driven by money. It's a billion-dollar industry, as we heard from the ILO, and when people are motivated by that much money, it makes it more dangerous for you.
It's a hugely profitable industry. I mean, this is the dirty business behind slavery. That those that are willing to exploit the most vulnerable can make massive profits from it. And so you need to tackle that business model, and you need to work with those who understand the problem. So we work with local groups that are on the front lines. They understand who the corrupt individuals are, who are the authorities that are willing to make a difference or are co-opted by those that are exploiting those in slavery. And you have to be very, very careful because there are threats. You're challenging a very profitable business. So you try and work with the police who are willing to make a difference and confront them. Of course, in the end, slavery is illegal. So you are confronting people and saying you're committing a crime. So if it's done properly, you can certainly make a difference, but you have to be very, very careful about how you go about doing this.
What about your business model, Nick? Do you believe in the efficacy of a private business group that can go in and work directly as you do? Because I guess governments will always be criticised for what they do and what they don't do and what signing a framework or an agreement actually achieves. Whereas a group like yours could perhaps go in of your own choosing and at least try to get the job done.
Look, it's a very good question. The reason slavery exists is you have a fundamental failure of government, right? Because slavery is illegal, fundamentally illegal. There's no arguments about the rights or wrongs of slavery. And it exists because the law is not being enforced. So our role is to perhaps go in and draw attention to the issues where they're not getting the attention and show what can be done. But in the end, what we need to do is mobilise governments, right? We need to mobilise groups in places like India and Thailand to drive change and to mobilise local authorities and then national authorities to make a difference. It takes time. But what we're finding with the whole issue of modern slavery is it's getting a lot more high-level attention these days. No one wants to be accused of being a country with a very high problem of slavery and forced labour. And so if we can draw attention and show ways in which you can make a difference, tackle the argument that people say it's always been with us, things don't change. We're trying to tackle that argument and show, in fact, we don't need to have slavery and we can make a difference. So that's where groups like ours can make a big impact.
Nick Grono from the Freedom Fund in London. Great talking to you. Thanks for your time. Finally this week, a quick update on a long-running story, the Greek debt crisis. Athens bought itself some time on Thursday by paying back $500 million to the International Monetary Fund. But time is short because Greece is still expected to run out of cash within weeks. Its creditors have frozen further aid until officials reach an agreement with the government on a package of economic reforms. And Eurozone finance ministers have also told Athens it must present acceptable proposals for fiscal, pension and labour market reform in just the 6 days after that loan repayment was made. Here's Barnaby Phillips, our correspondent who's covered the Greek debt crisis for years now, with more on Athens' big pay-up.
So the Greek government has cobbled together the money to make this latest payment back to the IMF, but there is the impression that it's living an increasingly hand-to-mouth existence, scraping together funds to make payments to the IMF and the European Central Bank as and when it needs them, and of course also struggling to raise the money to pay pensions and salaries to civil servants in this country. There's been a marked deterioration in relations between the Greek government and its various creditors. Irritation in some European capitals that the Greeks have come out in support of the Russians, Alexis Tsipras arguing that sanctions against Russia over its alleged interference in eastern Ukraine were not productive. And then there is this acrimonious dispute specifically between Greece and Germany, Greece demanding that Germany pay reparations back to Greece because of the Nazi occupation during the Second World War, an issue which the Germans feel very strongly was resolved many years ago. All of this leaves Greece in a very uncertain position as it negotiates with European creditors. The essential problem being that what the European Union is demanding of the Syriza government is incompatible with the promises that the Syriza government made to its own population when it was elected back in January.
Barnaby Phillips reporting there. That is our show for this week. There's more for you online though at aljazeera.com/CTC. Takes you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us by tweeting either me at Kamal AJE, our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, and do use the hashtag AJCTC as well. Or you can just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.